"Hey, you! Fancy suit doesn't make you better than anyone here," Officer Jake Marshall barked, his voice slicing through the busy street, loud enough to turn heads. The tall black man turned calmly, meeting Jake's sneer with a composed expression. "What's the matter? Too good to answer me?" Jake pressed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Or maybe you're lost. People like you don't belong around here." The crowd fell silent, eyes darting between the officer and the man in the suit. "Excuse me?" the man said, his voice steady yet cutting like steel. "You heard me," Jake shot back, leaning in closer. "What's a guy like you doing all dressed up? Who are you trying to fool? Because I'm not buying it." The man adjusted his tie, his expression unmoving. "You'll regret this soon," he replied quietly, but with unmistakable conviction. Jake chuckled, stepping back with a wave of dismissal. He had no idea that the man standing before him was Richard Johnson, the newly appointed chief of police, and his arrogance was about to cost him dearly. Richard Johnson stepped through the front doors of the Riverside Police Department with quiet confidence, his sharp uniform pristine, the badge on his chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At 45 years old, he carried himself with the calm authority of a man who had climbed every rung of a steep and unrelenting ladder. Today was his first day as chief of police, and he knew the weight of what that meant in a city as divided as Riverside. Inside, the station buzzed with activity, officers shuffling papers, fielding calls, and preparing for their shifts. But as Richard walked through, conversations paused mid-sentence, and heads turned, some in curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. He could feel the whispers before he heard them. "That's him," one officer muttered. "He doesn't look like much," another replied under his breath. In the corner, Jake Marshall leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his trademark smirk plastered across his face. "So that's the new boss," he said loudly, making no effort to hide his disdain. "What's he going to do? Teach us about social justice?" The group around him chuckled, though some exchanged uneasy glances. Richard heard the comments but didn't react. Instead, he strode through the room with an easy calm, stopping occasionally to shake hands or introduce himself. His approach was deliberate. He knew he couldn't win everyone over on day one, but he also knew he didn't have to. He stopped at one desk where a younger officer was nervously fidgeting with a stack of papers. "Good morning," Richard said, extending a hand. "Chief Richard Johnson, and you are—" The officer blinked, surprised by the directness. Officer Collins, sir." "Nate Collins." "Good to meet you, Officer Collins. Looking forward to working together." Collins nodded quickly, his nervousness giving way to a small smile. Richard moved on, his presence leaving a quiet ripple in his wake. By the time he reached his office, Richard could already see the lines being drawn. There were those who were cautiously optimistic, those who were indifferent, and then there were men like Jake, officers who didn't bother to mask their hostility. Closing the door behind him, Richard allowed himself a brief moment to exhale. He wasn't naive. He knew the path ahead would be rocky, but he wasn't here to be liked. He was here to lead. And as far as he was concerned, the resistance only strengthened his resolve. This was just the beginning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across a quiet residential street as a food delivery driver parked his bicycle near the curb. Adjusting the insulated bag on his shoulder, he scanned the house numbers, his face focused on finding the correct address. A police cruiser rolled up behind him, its lights flashing. Officer Jake Marshall stepped out, his expression a mix of boredom and disdain. "Hey, you!" Jake called out, his voice sharp. "What do you think you're doing here?" The driver turned, startled. "Delivering food, officer," he replied cautiously, lifting the bag for Jake to see. Jake scoffed, taking a step closer. "Sure you are. Or are you just scoping out the place? What's really in that bag?" "It's food," the man said quickly, unzipping the bag to show the containers inside. "I swear, I'm just trying to do my job." Jake's smirk grew as he crossed his arms. "Your job, huh? Then why do you look so nervous? Empty it, right here. Let's see what you've got." The driver hesitated, his hands shaking slightly. "Officer, please?" "Do it now," Jake barked, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of nearby residents. Some began recording the scene on their phones, their murmurs growing louder as the driver reluctantly began unloading the containers onto the pavement. "Is this really necessary, Officer Marshall?" A calm, familiar voice interrupted. Jake turned abruptly, his smirk faltering when he saw Chief Richard Johnson approaching, his sharp suit replaced with a more casual, approachable outfit. Richard had been walking the neighborhood as part of his efforts to understand the community better. Jake's irritation was instant. "Chief," he said stiffly, "didn't realize you were in the area." Richard's eyes moved from the food scattered on the pavement to the delivery driver, who looked visibly shaken. "Apparently not," Richard said evenly, his calm tone masking the tension beneath. "What exactly are you doing here?" Jake straightened, putting on his best act of confidence. "Just doing my job." This guy was acting suspicious. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? For delivering food?" Jake shrugged, clearly trying to maintain his bravado. "You never know, Chief. Gotta stay vigilant." "Vigilance is one thing, harassment is another," Richard replied, his voice steady but firm. He turned to the driver. "You're free to go. I'll handle this from here." The driver quickly gathered his things, nodding gratefully before leaving. Jake bristled. "With all due respect, Chief, I don't think you understand how we handle things on the ground." Richard's gaze hardened, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I understand perfectly, Officer Marshall, but from what I've seen today, you've forgotten what it means to serve this community. We'll talk more about this back at the station." Jake clenched his jaw, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Richard didn't wait for a response, turning and walking away with the quiet authority of a man who had just witnessed far more than Jake wanted him to see. Jake watched him go, his smirk now replaced with unease. Little did he know this incident was already being added to a growing list of grievances against him, and Richard's resolve to clean up the department had just been steeled. The tension in the Riverside Police Department was palpable as Jake Marshall entered Chief Richard Johnson's office, his steps heavy with defiance. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Richard sat behind his desk, his expression calm yet unyielding, a thick folder resting in front of him. Jake didn't bother to hide his irritation. He plopped into the chair across from Richard, leaning back with an air of defiance. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, flipping through its contents deliberately, as if weighing his next words. Finally, he looked up, his eyes locking on to Jake's. "I wanted to discuss your actions yesterday," Richard began, his voice steady but firm. "The incident with the delivery driver." Jake shrugged, feigning indifference. "What about it?" "The guy looked suspicious. I was doing my job." Richard leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Marshall, not to intimidate and humiliate. What I witnessed wasn't vigilance, it was unnecessary aggression." Jake's jaw tightened, but he smirked, masking his frustration. "Look, Chief, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know how to read people. Sometimes you have to be tough to keep the streets safe." Richard didn't blink. "Tough? Or reckless?" he shot back, his tone cutting. "Because what I saw wasn't about keeping anyone safe. It was about asserting power where it wasn't needed." Jake sat up straighter, his smirk fading. "With all due respect, sir, you weren't in my shoes. You don't know how things work out there." Richard's voice didn't rise, but it carried an undeniable authority. "You're right. I wasn't in your shoes. but I was standing close enough to see exactly how you handled the situation, and it's not the kind of behavior I'll tolerate under my leadership." Jake bristled. "So what now? You gonna write me up for doing my job?" Richard calmly closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone measured but resolute. "You will attend mandatory sensitivity training effective immediately, and while you're doing that, an internal review of your conduct, past and present, will be conducted." Jake's eyes widened. "A review? For what? This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Richard asked, his voice soft but cutting. "I've already seen enough to know there's a pattern, Officer Marshall, and patterns need addressing before they cause irreparable damage." Jake shot out of his chair, his face flushed with anger. "This is a witch hunt," he snapped. "You're just out to make an example of me because I don't fall in line with your agenda." Richard stood as well, his calm demeanor never wavering. "This isn't about an agenda. It's about accountability. If you can't see the difference, that's exactly why this is necessary." The two men locked eyes, the room thick with unspoken tension. Jake finally turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As Richard sat back down, the folder still open on his desk, he exhaled slowly. This was just the beginning. And he knew that bringing real change to Riverside's police department would be a fight. But it was one he was ready for. The fluorescent lights of the Riverside Mall cast a harsh glow over the scene unfolding near the food court. Shoppers stopped in their tracks as Officer Jake Marshall grabbed a teenage boy by the arm, dragging him toward the center of the open space. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. In his hand was a half-opened candy bar, the cause of Jake's fury. "Stealing, huh?" Jake barked, his voice loud enough to echo across the bustling mall. "You think you can just take whatever you want and walk out like it's yours?" "I'm sorry," the boy stammered, his voice trembling. "I was hungry. I didn't mean to—" "Don't you dare give me excuses," Jake interrupted, tightening his grip on the boy's arm. "This is what's wrong with kids like you. No respect, no accountability. You're lucky I'm not hauling you straight to jail." Shoppers whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Mothers clutched their children, steering them away from the shouting. The boy looked around desperately, his fear mounting under the weight of Jake's verbal assault. From the crowd, Officer Nate Collins stepped forward, his rookie badge gleaming under the mall's lights. "Jake, that's enough," Nate said, his voice calm but firm. Jake turned sharply, his glare cutting through Nate. "Stay out of this, Collins. This kid needs to learn a lesson." "Not like this," Nate replied, stepping closer. "It's a candy bar, Jake. He's scared out of his mind. Let's handle this the right way." "The right way?" Jake spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think letting him off easy is the right way? No wonder rookies like you can't handle the job." The boy sniffled, his hands shaking as Nate gently took him aside, crouching to meet his eye level. "It's okay," Nate said softly. "Put the candy bar back, and we'll talk to the store manager. No one's going to hurt you." Jake watched, his face flushed with fury, as Nate de-escalated the situation in a matter of seconds. The boy nodded quickly, wiping his eyes and clutching the candy bar as he followed Nate toward the store. When Nate returned, Jake was waiting for him by the entrance. "What the hell was that?" Jake snapped, his voice low but furious. "It was the right thing to do," Nate replied, meeting Jake's glare. "The right thing?" Jake hissed. "You embarrass me in front of everyone. You undermined my authority. You're weak, Collins. If you can't handle the job, maybe you should find something else to do." Nate didn't respond, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Unbeknownst to Jake, the entire incident had been captured on video by multiple shoppers. By the time the officers left the mall, the footage was already circulating online. Within hours, it was trending, a clip of a raging officer berating a terrified teenager while his partner tried to step in. Back at the station, Chief Richard Johnson sat at his desk, watching the video in silence. His jaw tightened as he replayed it, the weight of the department's reputation pressing heavy on his shoulders. Jake Marshall had crossed another line, and this time, the fallout was public. The streets of Riverside were quiet late that night, the soft hum of streetlights and the occasional passing car breaking the stillness. Driving home after a long day at school, Marcus Evans, a young black teacher, focused on the road ahead, the glow of his dashboard his only companion. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed behind him. Marcus sighed, pulling over to the curb, his mind racing. Had he been speeding? Officer Jake Marshall and his ally, Officer Paul Givens, stepped out of their cruiser, their heavy boots crunching against the pavement. Jake approached the driver's side, his flashlight glaring through the window. "License and registration," Jake barked. Marcus rolled down the window, his hands raised in clear view. "Sure, officer," he said, keeping his voice calm. "May I ask what I did wrong?" "Broken tail light," Jake replied curtly, though Marcus had checked his car that morning and knew everything was in working order. Marcus handed over his documents without hesitation. "It's all here, sir," he said. Jake snatched the papers, his eyes narrowing. "Step out of the car," he ordered. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked cautiously, his pulse quickening. "I said step out," Jake shouted, his tone sharp and commanding. Marcus complied, moving slowly to avoid escalating the situation. As soon as he was out, Jake grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the car. Marcus winced but didn't resist, his mind racing with fear and confusion. "You hiding something, huh?" Jake sneered, forcing Marcus against the hood. "Nothing, officer," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I'm just a teacher, heading home." Jake ignored him, snapping handcuffs around Marcus's wrists as Paul stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching silently. Bystanders began to gather, murmuring uneasily. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Marcus, his face pressed against the cold metal of the car, closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. After a tense few minutes, Jake finally stepped back. "You're free to go," he said dismissively, unlocking the cuffs and tossing Marcus's documents onto the hood. Marcus stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. "That's it?" he asked softly. "Move along before I change my mind," Jake snapped. Later that night, Paul called Jake. "That kid looks spooked," Paul said. "You think he'll file a complaint?" Jake chuckled darkly. "Let him try. I've dealt with worse. We'll handle it if it comes up." The next day, Chief Richard Johnson sat across from Marcus in the teacher's modest living room. Marcus recounted the events, his voice steady, but his hands trembling. "I wasn't speeding, my taillights weren't broken," Marcus said, his frustration clear. "I've never felt so humiliated. I teach my students to trust the police, but how can I now?" Richard listened intently, his jaw tightening as Marcus's words sank in. "I'm sorry this happened to you," Richard said, his voice firm with conviction. "And I promise you, it won't go unanswered. You have my word." Marcus's shoulders relaxed slightly, the weight of his story finally shared. As Richard left, his resolve hardened. Jake Marshall and Paul Givens had crossed the line, and this time the consequences would be unavoidable. The stakes had never been higher, and Richard was determined to see justice done. The tension in the interrogation room was suffocating. Paul Givens sat across from internal affairs investigators, beads of sweat forming on his brow. A stack of evidence, body cam footage, complaint records, and phone logs sat ominously on the table between them. Officer Givens, one of the investigators, began, her voice steady but firm. "We have enough evidence to proceed with or without your cooperation, but this is your chance to tell the truth." Paul hesitated, glancing at the door as if considering an escape. Finally, His shoulders sagged under the weight of reality. "It was Jake," he admitted quietly. "He always pushed me to keep an eye on certain neighborhoods, told me we needed to send messages to people who didn't belong." The room was silent as Paul continued, his words spilling out in a mix of guilt and frustration. "That night with the teacher, he told me to pull the guy over, said a little scare would remind him who's in charge." The investigators exchanged a look, their expressions grim. Paul's confession was damning, confirming a pattern of behavior that Richard Johnson had suspected all along. Later that day, Jake Marshall sat in the same chair, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. Across from him, Chief Richard Johnson and the Internal Affairs team stared him down. "Officer Marshall," Richard began, his voice calm but steely. "We've reviewed the evidence. Body cam footage, phone records, complaints. It paints a clear picture of misconduct. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. "This is a joke," he scoffed. "You're building a case out of nothing. Those complaints? Baseless. The footage? Taken out of context. And Givens? He's just covering his own ass." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "The evidence speaks for itself. Your pattern of targeting minorities, your excessive use of force, your blatant disregard for protocol. It's all here, Jake. This department will no longer tolerate it." Jake's face reddened, his voice rising in defiance. "You've been out to get me since the day you walked in here. This isn't about justice. It's personal." Richard leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You're right about one thing, Jake. It is personal. For the people you've harassed, intimidated, and humiliated. For the community you swore to protect but failed. And for this department, which deserves better than you." Jake slammed his fist on the table, standing abruptly. "You can't prove anything," he shouted. Richard didn't flinch. He slid a termination letter across the table. "You're fired, effective immediately," he said. "Turn in your badge and gun. You're done here." The news of Jake Marshall's termination spread through the station like wildfire. Some officers whispered in shock, others nodded in quiet approval, and a few expressed open relief. For years, Jake's behavior had been an open secret, one many had been too afraid to confront. Richard returned to his office, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. It wasn't just about Jake. This was a message to every officer under his command. The culture of silence and complicity was over. Accountability had arrived. Across town, Marcus Evans watched the evening news, his heart finally lighter as he saw the headline, "Officer fired amid misconduct investigation." It didn't erase the trauma, but it was a step toward justice. For Richard, the reckoning wasn't just a victory. It was the first step in rebuilding trust, both within the department and in the community it served. The hum of conversation filled the community center as Richard Johnson stepped to the front of the room. The faces of local leaders, activists, and concerned residents turned toward him, their expressions a mix of hope and skepticism. It had been weeks since the incident with Jake Marshall made headlines, and Richard had promised this meeting would mark the beginning of a new chapter. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began, his voice steady but sincere. "I won't sugarcoat it. Our department has fallen short of the trust you've placed in us. But I'm here to make sure that changes." He outlined his plan: mandatory bias training for all officers, stricter oversight of body cams, and a new complaint system that would guarantee transparency and accountability. As he spoke, the tension in the room began to ease. An older man raised his hand. "Chief Johnson, how do we know this isn't just talk? We've heard promises before." Richard met his gaze with unwavering honesty. "You're right to question me," he replied. But I'm not asking you to trust my words. I'm asking you to judge my actions. Hold me accountable, just as I'm holding my officers accountable. Together, we'll rebuild this trust." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, people began to speak, sharing their concerns and offering suggestions. Richard listened intently, taking notes, his resolve strengthening with each voice he heard. Across town, Marcus Evans walked home from the basketball court, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. The memory of that harrowing night still lingered, but knowing that change was happening brought him a sense of peace. At the station, Officer Nate Collins glanced at his reflection in a window, adjusting his uniform. He had become an unexpected symbol of positive change within the department, his actions at the mall inspiring both his colleagues and the community. Nate wasn't sure he deserved the praise, but he was determined to live up to it. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit apartment, Jake Marshall sat slumped on a worn-out couch, a half-empty beer bottle in his hand. The news played on the television in the background, the words barely registering as he stared at the pile of unopened bills on the coffee table. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Jake had once been a respected officer, or so he thought. But now, stripped of his badge, isolated from his colleagues, and branded as a symbol of everything wrong with the system, he had nothing left but his bitterness. "You did this to yourself," he muttered under his breath. But the weight of the truth only deepened his anger. Back at the community center, the meeting wrapped up with a standing ovation. As Richard shook hands with attendees, he felt the smallest spark of hope. The road ahead would be long, and the work would be difficult. But tonight was proof that progress was possible. Later that evening, Richard stood by his office window, looking out at the city he had sworn to serve. He thought of Marcus, Nate, and the countless others whose stories had fueled his determination. The reckoning wasn't just about removing one bad officer. It was about creating a system that truly protected and respected everyone. This wasn't the end of the fight, it was just the beginning. This story reflects real-life situations we often see in society today. It sheds light on how prejudice, abuse of power, and systemic neglect can harm individuals and communities, eroding trust and creating deep divides. Officer Jake Marshall's downfall wasn't just the result of his actions, but a culmination of years of unchecked behavior, allowed to thrive in a culture that avoided accountability. At its core, this story serves as a powerful reminder. True leadership and meaningful change require courage, integrity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Chief Richard Johnson's resolve to rebuild trust wasn't easy, but it showed that change is possible when we choose to act with principle and determination. This isn't just about the actions of a single officer or leader. It challenges all of us to reflect on our own biases and the role we play in shaping a more equitable and respectful society. The journey toward justice and trust may be long, but it starts with holding ourselves and others accountable. What are your thoughts on this story? Did it resonate with you? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories that challenge us to be better and inspire positive change. Thank you for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one.